Question.
Good morning. On the last day of the Jaipur Festival, I don't think Howard Jacobson needs any further introduction, so we're going to plunge right in. The original title, the title for the session now is the Finkler Question, but I believe the original title was The Writer's Life, or The Writerly Life. And I think, Howard, maybe it might be a little bit more instructive for us to trace the arc of your writing career, rather than sort of, and although we will get to the Finkler Question and discuss it quite extensively. And I'd like to kind of start at the end and then maybe circle back to the beginning by asking you to read a little bit from Zoo Time, from your latest novel. And then maybe we can talk about sort of the themes that you address in Zoo Time, okay, and go back to the beginning.
Just to explain, Zoo Time, which is my latest novel, is a comic novel about a serious subject. I don't normally like to talk about myself as someone that writes comic novels. I write tragic novels which are funny. This is a comic novel which is serious, and its subject is the end of literature. Its hero is a failed writer who believes that his failure is connected to the failure of people to appreciate literature, to read it, and so on. Things had not been going well in my neck of the woods. Not for me, on account of being a writer whose characters readers didn't identify with. Not for my wife, who didn't identify with my characters or with me. Not for Poppy Eisenhower, my wife's mother, where the problem, to be candid, was that we'd been identifying with each other altogether too well. Not for my local library, which closed only a week after I'd published a florid article in the London Evening Standard praising its principal refusal to offer internet access. And not for my publisher, Merton Flack, who, following a drunken lunch in my company, I had been the one doing the drinking, went back to his office and shot himself in the mouth. Even though I was the last author to talk to Merton Flack alive, the fact that he had a gun in his filing cabinet at least proved he must already have been thinking about doing away with himself. Nor did I think I was wholly to blame for the crisis in publishing, the devaluation of the book as object, the disappearance of the word as the book's medium, library closures, Oxfam, Amazon, e-books, iPads, Oprah Winfrey, apps, Facebook, Formspring, Yelp, 3 for 2, the graphic novel, Kindle, vampirism, all of which the head of marketing at Scylla and Charybdis Press mentioned in her eulogy as contributory to poor Merton's taking the drastic step he had. Of these, I was as much the victim as anybody else. Metaphorically speaking, at least, we all had pistols in our filing cabinets. Even those publishers who still had writers, even those writers who still had readers, knew the game was up. We laughed at what wasn't funny, dry, cancerous explosions like the guffaws of crows, and fell into moody silences as though anticipating the death of someone we loved, in the middle of what, in better times, would have been animated, not to say scurrilous, conversation. We had stones in our gallbladders, our spleens were engorged, our arteries were clogged. At one time, war or plague would have thinned our population out. Now, unread, we were dying of word gangrene. Our own unencountered words were killing us. A comic novel, as you see.
Never forgetting, of course, that a protagonist's or a character's view should not be confused for the author's view. I did think it interesting that Zoo Time, which spells such doom and gloom for the publishing industry and for fiction, came out, it was the first novel you wrote after you won the Booker Prize, which, should be a high point in any author's career, and I was wondering how that was structured, whether you'd started the novel already by the time the prize was announced.
I'd started it before the Finkler Question was published and before the Finkler Question won the Booker Prize. And then it was interrupted by the Booker Prize. Indeed, at one point I thought that the Booker Prize would spoil this novel, because I thought this could be the funniest novel I've ever written. I still think it's the funniest novel I'd ever written. And for a while I thought maybe winning the Booker Prize would mean I couldn't finish it. And I saw that as my ironic doom. Booker Prize ruins greatest comic novel that could ever have been written. But I was able to get back to it fine. The fact that I had won the prize should give everybody a clue that the character at the center of this novel isn't me. He is an unsuccessful writer. I am not an unsuccessful writer. He is disappointed with his life as a writer. I am not. He thinks it's all over for him. I think it's just beginning for me. So we are not the same person. But I understand some of the things that he feels, and I agree with some of the things that he says, but he is a preposterous person, and it is preposterous to think it's the end of everything. But also, it's a great deal of fun to write about the end of everything. I like playing the part of an Old Testament prophet. It's a lot more fun than people think being a prophet. It's exhilarating to be proclaiming the doom and the end. All those people who wandered through the Cassandra, wandering through ancient Greece, Jeremiah wandering through the Middle East 5,000 years ago, actually were very happy people. It's terrific fun saying it's finished. If I look at you and saying, you're hopeless, you've had it, you've all come to this festival, but this is the last festival you're ever going to come to because reading is finished, because books have had it, because you can't read. Hear what a good time I'm having as I'm saying it.
So you don't think things are quite as dire as the protagonist of Zoo Time does? It's not, to quote your an infamous sentence from the story, from the book, fiction is fucked. That's not necessarily true.
Well, it's what he says. Right. And his wife actually says he only thinks fiction is fucked because he's fucked. The reason you think everything is all over is because you are all over, usually. On the other hand, there are things we should worry about. Complaining about civilization has a rich literary history. There have always been writers who've said, it's all over. Aristophanes, how many thousands of years ago, was saying, look at the state of Greek theatre. We've got Aeschylus, we've got Sophocles, we've got Euripides. They're hopeless. It's finished. And this is a good, rich tradition. You always need somebody saying, it's over, it's finished. And it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. That's just part of the argument of literature. Some people will say we've never lived through better times, and others would always say it's never been worse. And it's never been worse, man. It's much more fun saying it's never. All the people I know who think things are really, really good, things are wonderful, the internet is marvelous, everybody is reading, they're unhappy people. Those of us who think it's all over are very cheerful.
I'll remember that the next time publishers tell me that books are doing well and so on. They're very unhappy people.
Very unhappy, and they're the ones that go home and shoot themselves in the mouth.
In Zoo Time, the protagonist has a primary school English teacher who doesn't wish at all to discuss the making of literature, the manufacturing of literature. And he says, I quote, "What business of mine is any of it? By the time I read the book, the doing is long done. The book belongs to me now." So it strikes me that very often the purpose of festivals such as this is to actually discuss the making and the manufacturing of literature, how it's done. And I was wondering whether you see, or what benefits you see accruing both to the writer and the reader from such discussions, which go on in festivals all over the world.
Yes. I am in a contradictory position here. I don't think I should be here. What I'm doing is wrong. You should not want to see me, you should not want to listen to me. You may feel after this you never want to see or listen to me again. But this is not really the business of literature. The novelist should never be seen and should never be heard for himself. The book should do all the work. You open the book, you read the book. All you need to know about the book is in the book. Everything else is just external flim-flam. The problem is I like doing this. I like coming here. This is terrific fun. It's flattering. I've just had an article, I've just been told by friends that an article has appeared in the London Evening Standard, the one I referred to in the piece I read out, saying that I've now got a fan club of 14-year-old girls here in Jaipur. A man my age to even know what a 14-year-old girl looks like is fantastic. When I speak in festivals in England, I don't see anybody under 90. I talk to I have big audiences, huge audiences, and I go in and my first thought is, how many of these people will be alive in an hour when I finish? And I come here and I see all these young faces and I see young people reading novels, and it's wonderful. It makes me feel exhilarated again, exhilarated in another way, from the pessimistic, prophetic way. So I can't resist doing them. But strictly speaking, we do have to ask whether this is an alternative for many people to reading itself, so that the literary event becomes an alternative to reading. If it doesn't, if what happens is you wander around here and you all hear readers and you pick and choose and you hear people talking about books that you want to read and you go away and you read them, then it's all wonderful. But the question has to be asked whether this could just be an alternative to reading.
And your own making of literature started rather late. I mean, you were 41 when your first novel was published, and you told me the other day.
40.
40.
40.
Okay, I see.
In fact, I think I was 30 now, but I was 35 when I started it.
Right, and it was published when you were 40.
39, 40, 40.
All right. And you told me
my age follows me everywhere I go. When I won the Man Booker Prize, I was the second oldest person ever to win the Man Booker Prize. And the oldest was William Golding, who was about 170 when he won it. So.
You told me the other day that the first novel that you wrote, was in a sense written out of desperation. And I was wondering if you could describe to us the circumstances that created this novel and that led you to write it and publish it.
I can a bit. I had always wanted to be a novelist. I'd never wanted to be anything else but a novelist. And it took me a long time to write the novel, to find a way of writing a novel. It's one thing to want to be a novelist. It's another thing to find the voice to write your novels in. And because I was a teacher of literature and a great reverer of literature, I just wanted to write a really great novel immediately. And I did. The trouble was, it had already been written. I wrote The Brothers Karamazov, I wrote War and Peace, I wrote Middlemarch, I wrote Persuasion. I sounded like everybody else. I couldn't find my own voice, which was why it took me so long. And then there were two kinds of desperation. One was my father, who, whenever I went back home to Manchester in the north of England, would say, "So where's this novel you're going to write? So where's this novel then?" Which made me feel he never believed me when I said I was going to be a writer. So I had to prove him wrong. And friends too who said, "So where's this novel then? Where's this novel?" And I used to say, you can be a novelist without writing a novel. You can live like a novelist. You can dress like a novelist. You can think like a novelist. And I did. I no longer, now that I'm a novelist, I don't dress now, I dress like a banker. But then I used to dress like a novelist, and I was a bohemian, and I lived like a novelist, and I thought it was very literal-minded of my father and all my friends to say, "So where's the novel then?" But I knew that the novel had to come along, and I found myself at the end of my academic career in an institution which, if I say it in England, just makes people laugh, but you won't know what it is. It was an institution called Wolverhampton Polytechnic. See, some people laugh just to hear. It's sort of the last place, one of the last places you ever want to end up teaching. I taught at Cambridge, I taught at Sydney University in Australia, and somehow or other I ended up at Wolverhampton Polytechnic in the Midlands in England on my own, very, very miserable. There was no food you could eat in Wolverhampton except Indian food. So I ate and I love Indian food, but it can make you very unhealthy if you eat in Indian restaurants 4 or 5 times a day. And that's what I did. I ate in Indian restaurants, I got very ill, the doctors took a blood test, they said, "You've got no blood. You've just got curry running through your veins." And I was unhappy in the institution, I was lonely, and then they moved the English department at Wolverhampton into Wolverhampton Wanderers football ground. So I was teaching in a football ground. I, who dreamed of being an Oxford or Cambridge academic and had been one, ended up teaching in a football ground. And I thought, there's only one thing I can do with this, to write about it. because the few things I had written, I always wrote when felt humiliated. For me, shame and writing go together. It was because I felt ashamed as a little boy, I don't know what of, or humiliated as a little boy, that I wanted to write. And here was the ultimate humiliation, teaching English literature, age 35, in a football ground in the English Midlands. And I wrote a comic novel about it. It wasn't War and Peace, it wasn't The Brothers Karamazov, it was a novel called Coming From Behind. It was a campus novel. I'd never wanted to write a campus novel. I'd never wanted to be on a campus. So I wrote the campus novel, and that was the beginning of my career. But the lesson of this is to aspiring writers, don't give up. You don't have to have written your first novel when you're 25. It can be a little bit later. But the sooner you find your own voice, the better. The sooner you find out who you are and face the fact that you're not Dostoevsky or Dickens or Tolstoy. It might not mean you're worse, it just means you're different. And finding your difference from the great writers is the hardest thing.
And actually, to aspiring novelists and aspiring writers, it might even be helpful to know what dressing like a novelist means. What exactly is that?
Well, it's kind of spattered jeans. You have a bit of paint on. And also you had in those days, remember, that was before computers, and you used to type, and you used to have a little thing called Tipex. Do you remember Tipex? It was like white paint, and you painted out your mistakes on the page. And I rather liked that because I felt it was writing was a little bit like being a painter, because you'd flash this little brush around. So you always had a little bit of Tipex on your jeans. That was good. And you had a torn shirt, and you had a beard. I've still got the beard. But then I had holes in my beard because I used to pull it out with exasperation. And this is the sign. Once you win the Man Booker Prize, you stop pulling your beard out.
You're not allowed to, I believe.
No, you're not allowed to touch your beard.
The contract says you're allowed to say.
Fingernails as well. I used to pull my fingernails. Won the Man Booker Prize. Beautiful fingernails.
Could you tell us a little bit about where you grew up? And you said you'd always wanted to be a novelist, and I'm wondering sort of what kind of reading you did when you were young and where you grew up and how that contributed to this urge to be a novelist.
I can't remember what I read. I know I read a lot, but I lie about my reading. I like to say that I was reading late Henry James novels when I was 5 or 6. That could not be the truth. But I don't remember reading any children's books. I just don't remember that. I kind of don't like children's books. I think children should be reading adult books. My example is always the English philosopher John Stuart Mill, age 3, was reading Herodotus. He could speak Latin, he could speak Greek. He had a father who believed the child's mind could be tested a lot more than children's minds usually are, and he proved it. He went on to have a nervous breakdown when he was 17, but we all go on to have nervous breakdowns when we're 17. At least he could speak Latin and Greek when he had his nervous breakdown. So even though I didn't read Herodotus myself, I like the idea that I might have, or that children could. There's a part of me, and I apologize to children's writers here, forgive me, I have a very rude scene about going to a children's writers conference in Zootown. But I just have a feeling that it would be good, really, if we just put young people onto adult books as soon as possible. You choose the adult books. You don't give them Lady Chatterley's Lover when they're 4. But you could give them Sons and Lovers when they're 12. You could do that. You could. I read Sons and Lovers when I was 12. What I do remember reading was sitting on my mother's knee when I was a little boy and her reading narrative poetry to me. My father read no books. My father was not at all an educated man. I'm not sure he ever read a book, actually. He was a market man. He sold things cheaply on the markets. He was a children's magician. He was a very entertaining, lively man. But it was my mother who read. She was not educated either, but she read, and she read me poems. And what she did was she put language in my head. She gave me the sound of the music of words, and I learned to love words from her. When I hear people often talking about, there's a cliche now that we're all interested in story. Everything is story. Whenever you hear writers talking, it's the story of our lives, the story. And it's true, stories are important. But for me, something preceded story, and that was language. The sound of language, the joy in what a sentence could do, the way in which, and even now as a writer, I don't care that much about story. Nothing that much has to happen for me. The life is in the sentences. A story, for me a story is that there's a comma, a semicolon, a colon, a dash, an asterisk, an exclamation mark, followed by a full stop. Is that full stop in the right place? Should the full stop have come earlier? Did the comma kill the full stop? Did the apostrophe murder the semicolon? This is story enough for me. And language, I think, is everything.
And is it a natural progression for people who love language to want to write, do you think? I mean, people who read usually love language as well, but the novelistic impulse seems indeed to be a storytelling impulse rather than a linguistic one.
Well, it was both for me, but the story I wanted to tell as a little boy was I was ashamed of something. I was embarrassed, I was humiliated, I felt that my life was ignominious, and that was the story I wanted to write. Whenever I did, before this first novel, my Wolverhampton Polytechnic novel written with curry in my veins, before I wrote that, I'd never written anything apart from a few articles and a few pages of stories. I never tried to publish anything. I just, because it was not good enough, I thought. The first thing I wrote, I published. But I did start to write stories, and there were always things I wrote after I felt I'd been humiliated. If I'd been jilted by a girl, I felt I had to write immediately I had to feel I had to write a story. And it was as though in the writing of a story, you overcome your shame. You overcome the humiliation and the pain. The writing assuages the pain, but it also gives you some kind of mastery over the experience. If I can write it, and particularly if I can laugh about it, because for me, writing and comedy have always been very closely allied. I've never wanted to, although I say I am not a comic writer, and not everything I write is meant for people to laugh at, I'm never satisfied really in any book I write unless there is laughter in it somewhere. And I never really love a book unless there is laughter somewhere. It might not be, I'm not talking about jokes, but I'm talking about that vitality of language. That, you know, the energy of a voice, which is akin to comedy. And the importance of this for me as a writer was that it gave me some mastery of a world from which I felt estranged. If you are the little boy who at school is the first person chosen to play on a football team, you're happy in the world. I was never picked for the football team. I was the last one left. And you could see each of the two teams were thinking, do you want him? I don't want him, I don't want him. I wasn't at home in the world. That which the world valued was not the thing that I could do. I did become a sportsman. I played table tennis. I was a serious table tennis player. I wrote a novel about table tennis. But you know, that was called ping pong. And nobody could take me seriously as a ping pong player. I was a very, very good ping pong player, but it was ping pong. So I never got any, no one thought this was of any value. So I was a person who felt I didn't properly fit into the world. And also I'd been estranged from the world because when I was the first child born. My father was in the army. I was brought up by my mother, her mother, and her sister. I had 3 women who thought everything that I did was wonderful. They clapped every word I spoke. They'd get me to dance and they'd say, oh, what a dancer, he's going to be a ballet dancer. They thought I was going to be an opera singer, a ballet dancer. They clapped me when I wet the bed. They gathered round and thought this was fantastic. And then a terrible, terrible thing happened. This is paradise. 3 women who loved me for 4 years. And then my father came back from the army and my mother had another child. Suddenly there was another little boy there. And although my mother and my grandmother and her sister had always used the word, he's clever, he's brilliant, he's smart, he's funny, he's got rhythm, he will do great things, there was a word that suddenly I heard when my baby brother was born that I'd never heard before. Beautiful. He is beautiful. So that made me realize I am not beautiful. I am in a world in which beauty is valued, and I am not beauty, and he's got beauty. So I tried to kill him. For 10 years, I did the natural thing, which was to try to kill him. I did once write a novel about Cain and Abel, because I know what it's like to want to kill your younger brother. But I was seriously, one can laugh about it now, and my brother is still alive. He survived all my attempts. But he's very careful around me. He keeps his distance still, and we are good friends. But he knows what was in my heart, and I know how much fear he felt. But when a brother comes along like that and steals your paradise, this is very hard. I mean this quite seriously. It's very, very hard to overcome that, and you remain an exile from paradise from that day onwards. And being a novelist who is funny is one of the ways that you can deal with that.
And so you've said that you were drawn, in a sense, to this comedic voice, that that your response to a lot of these situations was to be comic. And you wrote these articles in Cambridge, you wrote these shorter stories. And when you were writing Coming From Behind, what did it entail to sort of convert this voice, this comedic or comic voice, into a novelistic voice? Was there sort of a writerly act of imagination needed, a leap of faith?
It needed desperation. It needed a great deal of time and concentration. And it needed the realization that to write, people sometimes think that if you're a comic writer, you're doing something easier than if you're a tragic writer, or that you can write it more quickly. In fact, what you learn is that to write a sentence that will make people laugh, it's one thing to make a person laugh when you can look into their eyes, when you can use your body, when you can express things, when you can smile. But to make people laugh on the page when they've got nothing to go on but words, I'm not going to say it's difficult because it's something that I do, but it's hard work. It's as hard a work as anything else. There is no other kind of writing that's more difficult. The most beautiful lyric poetry does not require more concentration than comic writing requires. Your timing has to be perfect. The comma has to be in the right place. It has to go on so long. Too long, it's finished. Too short, it's not right. So you learn, I discovered that I just had to sit there and work at it and work at it and work at it, and that a good day was 300 words. And that if I wrote 1,000 words in a day, I would feel ill at the end, as though I'd been sick, as though I'd sicked up language. And I am still like that now. I can only write a few words in a day, otherwise you feel bad about it. And
in our conversation earlier, you had mentioned, allied to this sort of this discovery of the comic voice and the novelistic voice, was also the realization that you would, in a sense, write about your roots, about being Jewish in England. And I was wondering, maybe to set up a reading of the Finkler Question, if you could very quickly address why you felt it was necessary as a novelist to go back to that particular root of yours, even though you were also a Mancunian, you were also a Britisher.
Well, one of the reasons it took me so long to write a novel was I was trying to write the wrong kind of novel. I wanted to write, because one of my great heroes was Henry James, I had Henry James on the one side and D.H. Lawrence on the other. I wanted to write about being a miner, like D.H. Lawrence. What did I know about being a miner? Or I wanted to write about English country house life. What did I know about English country house life? I went to Cambridge as a young man, and I thought when I go to Cambridge, I put my working class northern Jewish roots behind me, and I will now be a gentleman, like Pip in Great Expectations. I was the same. I will now be a gentleman. And I expected that I would meet a woman with a title, Lady somebody or other, and she would fall in love with me, and I would go and live in her country house in a castle somewhere in Kent, and there'd be a little cottage for my parents to come and stay in, and they could do the gardening and something. I really dreamed that that's what my life in Cambridge would be like. I never met Lady anybody. I never met a woman in Cambridge. I couldn't find a girl in Cambridge. I couldn't see one. They just weren't there. They were not what I recognise. What girls look like in Manchester and what girls look like in Cambridge were just entirely different. In Manchester, girls wore very high heels. No girl wore a high heel in Cambridge. And if they didn't wear high heels, they weren't girls to my eye. When you go to Cambridge, I'll just tell you this quickly. When you go to Cambridge, you are advised that the first thing that you do is you buy a packet of crumpets. I don't know if you know what crumpets are. Crumpets, and you buy a toasting fork. Because in your room at Cambridge, you have a little gas fire. And the idea is that you toast crumpets on your gas fire for when you bring a girl back to your rooms. You buy a teapot, you have a lot of tea bags, you make tea, and you toast crumpets.
Is that a euphemism, toasting crumpets?
No, it sounds like a euphemism, but it's not. You actually literally toast a crumpet. You go out to find a crumpet and you toast a crumpet for her. So I bought my toasting fork, I bought the crumpets, and if I tell you that after 3 years in Cambridge, that packet of crumpets was still there, now turned completely black. It never happened, Inge. So but I still went on dreaming I would write novels about the English aristocracy, about whom I knew nothing. And it was only when I realized that the world on which I'd turned my back, the world, the Manchester world, the life of the streets in Manchester, Jewish slang, little bits of Yiddish, market language that I'd heard as a boy, should be in my voice. There was no point in sounding like an English aristocrat. I wasn't one. I was from the north of England, working class-ish, Jewish. Those elements should be in my voice. And I'm ashamed to think of the years that I wasted not knowing that. That's another piece of advice to a writer. Know where you come from. You don't have to tell the story of your life all the time. You don't have to tell the story of where you come from. But the vitality of your voice will be very much connected to. And you should learn at my age how to use a microphone too. So until I allowed the language of the world that I had come from to play some part in my writing, I couldn't write.
We're just going to quickly get another mic for Howard.
Probably just.
Is that what it?
How's that?
That's
yeah,
good.
Thank you.
Well, we were actually going to move on to the Finkler question, but I just have a last quick question on sort of comic writing before we turn to this, since we were talking about it a little bit. Is there sort of a tradition, is a particular tradition or a vein of English comic writing that you see yourself falling into or that you look up to? I mean, Lawrence Stern or
Stern I hate.
You do?
I don't like Lawrence Stern. I think Tristram Shandy is the most overrated novel in the English language, and I think it led to a tradition of comic writing that has got almost nothing to be said for it. It led to the English version of magic realism, and I think that is a dead end. Somebody's just got up to go out, probably a descendant of Lawrence Stern or something. I never liked that, but there is a tradition of English savagery which I like, the savagery of someone like Ben Jonson, and something that you do get. Fielding a little bit, Smollett a little bit, but for me, Dickens is the great. Dickens is the great. Dickens and Jane Austen is a great comic writer. Dickens and Jane Austen gave me all I needed in the way of an education in comic writing, and then my contribution was to add to these very, very English writers the thing I've just described, the Jewishness. And nobody was doing that. Not really. I can't think of anybody who was doing that until I did it. It was to turn Jane Austen into a Jewish writer is really what I've done. I mean, I've called myself a Jewish Jane Austen before, and I said it as a joke originally, but I actually mean it. I sort of do Jewish Jane Austen-y things.
Okay, maybe with that we'll move into the Finkler question, and if I could request you for a reading, and then we could talk a little bit about the novel as well.
I'll read a rather different kind of passage from the Finkler question. I think one of the reasons that the Finkler question won the Man Booker Prize, although a lot of people said at last a comic novel wins the prize, I think there was a melancholy in the Finkler question which was what really caught the imagination of the judges. That's my understanding of it. In particular, melancholy around one particular character who was a Czech called Libor Sevcik, who's lived in England a long time, who's a 90-year-old man, who used to be a show business journalist, but he's too old to have a job now, but whose wife has just died. He was in love with her for 60 years, and then she dies. And it's the story of his story is, what do you do? What do you do if you've loved somebody so much and you are now still alive at this age? How do you live after the death of somebody you care about? And this is a scene in which his friends arrange for him to meet a younger woman. So this is his date, a kind of date with a younger woman. What's your favorite color? She asks. He can't hear. Mozart. And your star sign? My eyesight. No, your star sign. Your star. Oh, star. Jane Russell. So had begun Libor's first date of his widowhood. The girl, she must have been in her late 30s, but that still made her a girl to Libor, did not appear to know who Jane Russell was. Libor wondered where the problem lay, in the accent he had not quite lost, or the hearing he had not quite kept. It was beyond his comprehension that Jane Russell could simply be forgotten. Russell, he spelt out. Jane, J-A-N-E, beautiful big. He did the thing men do, or the thing men used to do, weighing the fullness of a woman's breasts in front of him, like a merchant dealing in sacks of flour. His date for the evening looked away. She had no chest to speak of herself, Libor realized, and must therefore have been affronted by his mercantile gesture. Though if she'd had a chest, she might have been more affronted still. The things you had to remember with a woman you hadn't been married to for half a century. The feelings you had to take into account. A great sadness overcame Libor. He wanted to be laughing with his wife Malky over it. And then, do you know what I said, Malky? Libor, you didn't say that. I did, Libor. He sighed, wanting it to be over, and showed the girl his old hands. The flesh, disfigured with liver spots, was loose enough for her to slide her fingers under. It would peel clean away like skin on a lightly roasted chicken. His knuckles were swollen, his fingernails dull and yellow and bent over at the ends. Then he ran his hands over his baldness and inclined his head. He'd always been a balding man. Balding had suited him, but he was plucked clean by time now. The patina of extreme old age was on him. He wanted her to see her own reflection in his pate, measure all the time she had left in the dull mirror of his antiquity. He could tell she couldn't figure out what he was showing her. When he used to present his bald head to Malky, she would polish it with her sleeve. It used to excite her, not just the sight of the head, but the act of polishing it, as though he were her furniture. It amused him to be her furniture. You can open my drawers whenever you like, he would say, and she would laugh and cuff him with her sleeve. At the end, when she was dying in front of his eyes, they had talked dirty to each other. It was their defense against pathos. She wanted him to laugh because they had laughed so often together. Laughter had been his most precious gift to her. And now, at the last, she wanted laughter to be her final gift to him. I'm sorry, he told the girl, calling for the bill. This isn't fair to you. She was as relieved as he was when they parted.
I don't want to rehash too much the discussions of another panel you were on the Jewish novel, but it's difficult in a way to talk about the Finkler Question without talking about the Jewish novel. And first of all, there's an interesting parallel in the sense that our Gentile hero, Julian, adopts for himself a Jewish identity and sees his life gain a certain coherent narrative through that identity. And I see that possibly as a parallel to your own writerly life and the fact that you gained your writerly narratives through looking back to your own Jewish identity.
Yes, I think that's a nice point. People have said to me, how was I able to imagine what it's like being a Gentile, staring at Jewishness as though it's a mysterious thing? It's the easiest thing I've ever had to write because I've never known what being Jewish is, really. I wasn't brought up religiously Jewish. I wasn't brought up in a family that understood philosophically Jewishness or ever even thought about it. We just were it. That was it. We just did it. We just were it. We didn't go to the synagogue. We didn't practice ritual. We weren't careful what foods we ate, but we were just Jewish. That was all. And then, so for me, writing about being Jewish has been about thinking about being Jewish and trying to discover what Jewishness is, how much I like it, what it is, what it means to me, what it's for. So in the Gentile character, there's probably more of me, if you like, than there is in any of the Jewish characters in the novel. He was important to the novel. Julian, the Gentile who wants to be Jewish, was important in the Finkler Question. The Finkler Question, among other things, is partly about Jews in England saying, is there anti-Semitism in the world? Is there anti-Semitism still in England? To what degree should we worry about it? Is it absurd to see it wherever you go? Under every stone is an anti-Semite, he's an anti-Semite. There's kind of jokes about it. In the early days when I'd go back to Manchester and I'd meet some of my friends and they'd say, that was a good novel you write last year, why didn't you win the Man Booker Prize for it? And I would say, I don't know. And then they'd look to see if anybody was listening and they'd go, are they anti-Semites? And you always kind of wonder, oh, it's a question, were they anti-Semites? Who's to say? You can't talk about anti-Semitism without, if you're Jewish, without, certainly in England, without being very angry and also having a keen sense of the ridiculousness of it, because you don't meet it every day. You meet it, I've met it very, very rarely. I've met some of it, but mainly I've not encountered it. On the other hand, that's what people in Germany were saying in the 1920s, and that's a very Jewish thing to say. People were saying there was no anti-Semitism in Berlin in the 1920s. So do we learn a lesson from that, or is that preposterous too? It's also my experience being Jewish in England that lots of people who are not Jewish are very pro-Jewish, interested in it, like it, kind about it, curious, inquisitive. So in Julian, I wanted to do justice to that. You can't write about anti-Semitism in England without having somebody who is not in the slightest bit anti-Semitic. Though some people have said he's the biggest anti-Semite of all because he doesn't know what Jews are and he stereotypes them. And he thinks they're all noisy and they make good jokes. Well, he's right, they do make good jokes. But I'd never think that stereotyping is a form of prejudice, actually. I don't mind stereotyping.
That's what they said in Germany in the 1920s.
Good joke.
You've said in an interview, I mean, the circumstances under which the Finkler Question was born, you had said that the book sort of came to a boil in early 2009, around the time of Operation Cast Lead, and England had, quote unquote, turned into an uncustomarily frightening place for Jews. So could you explain that a bit more? I mean, what was sort of frightening about the circumstances in which the book was born?
It was to do with the temperature of the reporting of events in the Middle East. I don't want to go into, Zionism and anti-Zionism and things. Zionism is a very interesting subject. The best thing that was said about what's going on in the Middle East was said by the Israeli novelist Amos Oz, a great writer, Amos Oz, not a comic, one of the few Jewish writers who's not a comic Jewish writer. But we talked about that the other day too. To be a Jewish writer in Israel is not like being a Jewish writer anywhere else. But anyway, Amos Oz was in England and he said, look, people keep talking about this as though there's a right or a wrong here. When the Palestinians say that country belongs to them, they are right. It does. And when the Jews say that country belongs to them, they are right. It does. So you've got a tragic situation here. And I've always believed that. I've always believed that both people have a great deal of right on their side. What was more than annoying me, frightening me about the way the situation is often reported in England, particularly by the left-wing press, The Guardian, my own newspaper that I write for, The Independent, is the anti-Zionist rhetoric, as though there's only one good guy here and there's only one bad guy here. And my approach to this subject has always been really as a literary critic. What do they mean when you call someone a fascist? What are you saying? You can't call anybody you disagree with a fascist. You can't call anybody you disagree with a Nazi. You should think very, very hard before you call a Jew a Nazi. You would only call a Jew a Nazi, I think, whatever they've done. You would only choose that word if you want to hurt them. There's no other justification for it. I don't care what they've done. So I don't care how badly the Israelis were behaving. Say they are badly behaving, but when you use that kind of language, I mistrusted the motives. And I continue to mistrust. If I see someone saying fascists or Nazis, or if I see someone saying, for example, the Holocaust. The Jews went through the Holocaust. Therefore, they are the last people who should be treating the Palestinians the way they do. I don't want to see any Palestinian mistreated. But you don't talk to Jews about the Holocaust as though it was an education. The Holocaust was not a university in which you were meant to get a degree in humanity. And people talk about it now as though Jews failed their education of the Holocaust, and there should have been much, much better, much more refined people after it. It wouldn't surprise me, actually, if people who went through the Holocaust were not at all nice after it. When you've been through an experience like that, it's not guaranteed to make you nicer people. But that's another point. It's not guaranteed to do anything. And it's sometimes talked about almost as though what Jews do, and I've seen it almost said like this, what Jews are doing in Israel now almost vindicates the Holocaust. It's a kind of retrospective guilt. All right, they didn't deserve the Holocaust, but the way they're behaving now shows that they got their deserts 50 years ago, and I am very wary of that kind of language.
But the temperature of that reporting that you experienced in 2009, I mean, did that also translate into the sort of on-the-ground anti-Semitism that, for example, Julian encounters in the Finkler Question? Was there actually a tangible increase in anti-Semitism on the streets?
It's very, very hard to say. There are people who monitor these things, and you hear things which are shocking, and swastikas appear on. My own grandmother's gravestone had a swastika painted on it 40 years ago. The family went there, cleaned it off. Did it amount to anything? Who knows? Was it just something that some kids did? You never know what these things amount to. You hear of Jewish kids being abused at schools, sometimes by Muslim kids, sometimes just by Gentile kids. I never felt that the streets, when I go to America to talk, the American Jews think that London is a dangerous place. It's terrifying. That, you know, if you're Jewish, you're in hiding all the time in London. It isn't like that. I never felt that the streets became dangerous. But I felt that there's more than one way of being hurt. You don't only have to be punched in the face to be hurt. You can be hurt by language. And I felt that the language, coming from people who should have known better, educated language from journalists who should have known better, was itself aggressive and meant harm to me as a member of that community. And that was the danger I felt. It was the danger of language. And we all know that language is very powerful, and you have to keep your eye open, because what starts as language can end up as something else. But so far, it hasn't substantially ended up as anything else.
Well, I mean, very appropriately, of course, your response to that kind of language was another kind of language, which was the Finkler Question itself, which in a way has a sort of poetic circularity to it. We have about 10 minutes more, so I think we're going to start taking questions from the audience. If you have questions, please put your hand up. There's microphones floating around, and they will come to you.
Hello. I was just wondering, you mentioned how language and the beauty of it matters so much more to you when you're writing. So there are times when I'm writing just for the fun of writing for myself, and I experience that there are parts of writing which, in terms of expression or the language, really appeal to me, even when I'm writing myself. And even though they feel redundant to the context, in the sense they could be dropped out, I feel like I don't want to drop them out, and that sort of puts me into a spot in terms of editing it out later or something like that. Does that ever happen to you? Like a conflict between the love of language and the context in terms of the story?
Well, I know what you mean, but the love of language shouldn't be separate to the other business of writing your book. It's integral. I mean, you're dealing with language the whole time. If you feel that there's something that's a little too florid and a little too fancy, then yes, you are, every writer will be his or her best judge of this. If you think that, you're probably right. Get rid of it. But that's not because, if you shouldn't feel that you're playing with language, that whatever you do with language when it really pleases you is separate from the book itself. That's what the book should be. That's what the story should be. But of course, we make a joke too much, we shed a tear too much, we overwrite sometimes. And that's the hardest thing, really. To what degree, at what point is, underwriting more appropriate? At what point is overwriting actually a joy for your reader? And that's just your ear. It's your ear will decide what goes on the page, and then your reader's ear will decide whether it works or not. In the end, you are in the hands of whether people like it.
Hey, earlier you said you used to write primarily out of humiliation. So let's say a girl dumps you or something like that happens. Would you narrate that, would you transcribe that experience to feel better? And or would you actually write a story or something very unrelated to feel like a writer so that you feel better? Do you write exactly what happened or just something else so that you...
Well, it's never exactly what happened, because the minute you put it on a page, it's different. I mean, the minute you make any kind of art of experience, it is just different. It's changed, because you are controlling it. But yes, sometimes I would write those, you know, sometimes a thing happens that's so painful that you feel you have to write a version of it, of the very, very thing, of that very, very thing. And certainly when I was young and writing those stories, I would go out and a girl would dump me, and then I would write that story, the dumping. The difference being that while I was being dumped, I would come home in tears, and while I was writing the story, I was joyful because I had made comedy out of it. I don't mean laughed at the girl, I mean laughed at me. Because if you can laugh at yourself, if you can laugh at your own ignominy and pain, you've beaten it. This is a wonderful thing about writing. You've assumed a kind of, you don't have to lie about it, but you've assumed a kind of mastery of it by virtue of being able to write about it.
Howard, for my curiosity, I was a student of a Jewish professor 30, 40 years ago, and I have a dear friend of 50 years friendship. I met in Pelham, and we are in touch with each other even today. What I found as a student of my professor, David Sofer in Syracuse University, he was very fussy about language. He used to tell me, don't be journalistic in writing. And what you were saying about your painting on your pen and everywhere, that's what happened to my PhD also. And another friend who is not so much educated, but social worker, he lives in the Yosemite National Park, and you talk anything, he will be very finicky about language, educating you about things. There's something to do with my curiosity, to do with the Jewish character, to be perfect. And is there any difference between Sephardic and non-Sephardic Jews?
Sephardic and non-Sephardic Jews is a big question, and I can't address that one. But the other one with the perfection, there is something about Jews do see themselves as, Jews do take art. We're not the only people to take art seriously, but when Jews make art, they do make art very, very seriously. And I was talking about this the other night. And my suspicion is, and this is just, I've not worked this out, because when Moses came down the mountain with his commandments, one of the commandments from God was that you shouldn't make art. This is my world, God says. I made this world. You will not make any likeness of any living being on the land, in the air, or in the sea. You shall not make a likeness. This was taken to mean you shall not make art. And so, you know, you go into a synagogue and there are no paintings on the wall. The Jewish religion does not have statues. We don't have, the Christians have Jesus Christ. We don't have Moses. We don't, you know, it's very plain. There is at the heart of the religion an austerity. So when artists come along, they feel they are doing something blasphemous. We are working against, we are opposing God. We are being another God. But because Jews, however anti-Jewish some Jews are, somewhere in their soul, they all remember Moses coming down that mountain. We've got long memories, Jews. I remember Moses coming down the mountain. I was there. I was dancing around the golden calf when Moses came down. I take seriously those commandments even when I break them. Thou shalt not commit adultery. You commit adultery, of course you do. But adultery is so much better for knowing that there's a commandment that's saying you shouldn't commit it. They're very, very important things, these commandments. And the making of art is so much better for knowing that you shouldn't make it. So that when you do make art, you think it is enjoined upon you to be extremely serious. So you get people like Rothko, the painter Rothko, who saw himself as a kind of priest, or a novelist like Philip Roth, who has lived a sort of priestly life in the name of making art. And I think that's the name of the perfection. Other people take art as seriously as Jews take art. Of course they do. But nobody takes the making of art more seriously than a Jew.
Hi, this is in terms of modern literature and the doom of the publishing industry as it is. do you think that what's happening in literature now can it be even said, can it even be called literature? For example, The Catcher in the Rye is something that I consider literature when I read it. But according to a teacher that's older than me, she said that's just a cult classic. You can't consider that literature. So do you think that it's possible to create, well, good literature in modern times?
Yes, and I think I think you were right, Catcher of the Rye is good literature. It is a good book. It was a cult classic, but that doesn't mean it wasn't also a good book. Yes, I do think it's possible. I think there's some fantastic books being written. The problem I have at the moment, I think novels are in a very, very healthy state. My worry at the moment is not the writing of novels, it's the reading of them. Because I think there are assumptions about what readers, not you, because you're all here. I accept you from this generalization. But there are assumptions being made about novels, particularly, which are false and which are detrimental to the creation of the novel. The idea, for example, that you have to like the characters. I've gone to reading groups, and you go to a reading group, and the first thing people say is, I didn't like the characters. And you say, so what? Then they say, I couldn't identify with the characters. And at that point you say, okay, put your books down, and I used to be a teacher of literature, I'm now going to teach you about literature. You don't go to a book to find yourself. Sometimes you will find yourself. One of the reasons people like The Catcher in the Rye is lots of young boys identified with Holden Caulfield. That's great when it happens. But when it doesn't happen, it might not be the book's fault. Sometimes the reason you can't identify with a character, I say to these people, is you've got no imagination. You're stupid. Sometimes the reason you don't like a book is you're just plain stupid. And you're plain stupid if you go to a book with your mind made up about what a book should be and what a book should do. Every book should be a new experience. Every book is a new raid on your expectations of what a book is. And if a book takes you somewhere that you've never been before, this is what a book should do. You don't go to a book to have your sympathies confirmed. You go to a book to have your sympathies changed. If you don't like anybody in a book, good. If you don't feel comfortable with a book, good. I've had reviews in which people have said, I'm not having this book. In the first 100 pages of this book, there were 25 words I didn't know. That person should have written me a letter of gratitude. Thank you for introducing me to 25 words I didn't know.
My question is about Julian in the Finkler Question. He was, for me, one of the most unforgettable, hilarious characters I've ever come across in literature. And I completely fell in love with Julian. I'm just curious to know how you conceived him.
How did this idea of a Gentile who adopted a Jewish identity come about in the first place? I mean, as a sort of a narrative technique.
Yes, all right, well, both the same question. Very, very hard to describe how these things happen. There is a magic when you write. I absolutely believe in this. There is a magic. That you start writing something, you just make, it's like an artist will tell you, they make a mark on a page in the morning, and then something happens. Great painters will tell you that they know what they're going to do in the morning. Of course, if they're halfway through a portrait, they know they're doing that portrait. But if they know where it's going to finish, if in the morning you know what you're going to be doing at the end of the day, something has gone wrong. You don't know how things start. Characters take over if you let them. If you write with rigidity, then your book will be rigid and the characters won't live. But if you let the characters live, they will go in their own direction. They will do what they want to do. They will have their own life. Things happened. Julian has a tragic story in this novel. I never knew he was going to have it. All that happened at the beginning of this novel was I was walking along the street one night. I'd had a little bit too much to drink. I'd been to dinner with some friends, and I was walking down the middle of London, but it was late at night, and I saw a dark figure in a doorway, and I thought I was about to be mugged. I thought, this figure looks threatening, I'm going to be mugged. And I thought, well, what will I do? Well, I know what I'd do. I'd say, here's my wallet, here's my phone, anything else you want, here's the key to my house, take everything. Because I'm not physically courageous in that way. Anyway, I walked on and kept looking, and then I noticed two things. One, that the person wasn't threatening, and the other, that it was a woman, a large woman. And I thought, what if a woman had mugged me? How would I felt had a woman mugged me? Well, they would have said, here's my wallet, here's my phone number, maybe, is the joke. I don't mean that. And out of that, really, I suddenly thought, well, I just saw a story in that. There's somebody being a man of a particular kind being mugged by. That's all I began with. And out of that began, and then I thought, well, I want a figure who's walking along the street, who's already anxious. And I gave Julian some of my anxieties, because sometimes when I'm walking down a street, I think I'm going to walk into a lamppost, or I think I'm going to walk into the street and get hit by a car. And as I think about it, I feel the pain. You must all do this. You feel the pain in your knees. You know, you go weak and trembly in anticipation of disaster. And I thought, I want this person to be a kind of person who anticipates disaster. And so when this woman mugs him, as she does in the novel, this will be something he's somewhere been expecting to happen all his life. And then I thought, well, maybe that's a kind of Jewish thing. Then I thought, well, I don't want to make it too obvious. Maybe let's have someone not Jewish anticipating this. And then suddenly he was a not Jewish person anticipating disaster in a Jewish kind of way. Well, then let's put him in a Jewish world. And he just took over from that, really.
We're going to have one last question. Or maybe we won't. Oh, there's one here.
Rashmi Dickinson. You quite often said how Jewish people are very good at laughing at themselves. Whereas in India, it's totally different. Just yesterday, one of the authors had to run away from the literature festival. Similar thing happened last year because somebody dared to say that whatever the statement might be, that somebody didn't agree, and the FIR has been lodged, and so on and so forth. Why are the Indians so different from the Jewish? Why would you think? What would your comment be?
Well, I don't know, forgive me, but I don't know enough about India, but I've caught some of the story that you were talking about, and this is not, it seems to me, unique to India. This is something that's, and I don't doubt that you would find it in the Jewish community too. Jewish communities, just because Jewish writers can write wonderfully funny, that doesn't mean there's no Jew that isn't quick to take offense. Jews can be quick to take offense. We are living in a world in which everybody is quick to take offense. And it bothers me a great deal, both here and anywhere, that people think that if they are offended by something, this is not a million miles away from thinking, I don't like the characters in your book, therefore the book's no good. People use their state of being offended as a measure of something. And, you know, we would be in how you cure all this, I don't know, but all writers have to fight and propagandize against this. Taking offense is hard luck. It's just bad luck. Offensive things will be said to you. Offensive things will be said about your religion, about you personally, and about your faith, and you have to accept it. If you're going to have free speech, there's no point having free speech if it's only free speech that's nice to you. If we really believe in free speech, if we feel a writer must be free to say what he likes, if we feel a comedian must be free to make any jokes he likes, then he must be free to be as rude as he likes. And we just have to live with it and find another way of counteracting. But calling in the police because someone has said something offensive is grotesque. I mean, here we were talking about, you know, the end of literature. That's the end of civilization. That's the end of language. And, you know, you have had in this part of the world, you've been involved in this part of the world in one of the most terrible scandals, in the Salman Rushdie scandal. I mean, that was absolutely monstrous, the idea that someone who writes a book, the banning of books, the banning of words, the banning of writers, we all have to see. If ever there's a place in which we have to say no to that, no books banned, no words banned, no opinions banned, we're offended, tough luck, answer back. Ever there's a place where we must say that, it's here.
That's a very good note to end on. Thank you so much, Howard. This has been a great conversation. Thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, Howard.